several organizations state that no UVC radiation reaches the Earth's surface. It's wrong. I have data to prove that.
This is Dane Wigington with Geoengineeringwatch.org. As we plunge ever further into uncharted territory on planet Earth, an issue that has been completely overlooked, that is of grave importance, is the rapidly disintegrating ozone layer of our planet. This issue by itself is a near-term existential threat. Geoengineeringwatch.org first began to meter the intense UV radiation in 2014. And we reported on this in 2014 that we were getting UVC on the surface of the planet. When we first posted this information, our website was taken down within 15 minutes and was taken down 8 times in the next 3 days. We had to acquire more security for our website, and we were able to keep the data up after that point in time. And I think for those in power, they begin to realize that the public simply doesn't care about this, or simply doesn't believe it. And yet we can feel the intense UV radiation on our skin, on surfaces. It rapidly heats the interiors of cars that are locked up, and we see more and more coverage of this on the Weather Channel and other sources, that the car interiors are heating up at extraordinary speed. This is a very penetrating radiation. It can kill microbial life, kills plankton. It burns foliage on trees. It scorches the southwest side, or the sun-exposed side. If you're in the northern hemisphere, it would be the southwest side. But it scorches the sun-exposed side of many types of trees. It burns the Cambrian layer, the living layer of the tree, all the way down to the core wood. And this is extraordinarily visible. And we see this direct correlation between the decline in insect life, which there's many factors affecting that, not denying that. But UV radiation alone, again, is an existential near-term threat on our planet. And this information has been systematically hidden from the public. And the public tends to ignore anything that is not confirmed by official sources. Even if they can feel the sun burning on their skin, they convince themselves they're just getting older or more sensitive. That's not the case. We are getting extraordinarily high amounts of not just UVB on the surface, but UVC as well. I want to introduce today, or it's a second coverage, I should say, want to have another conversation with Ray, a former NASA contract engineer. We're going to keep it at his first name on this exchange, who has metered UV radiation for Geoengineeringwatch.org over a number of years with equipment that we supplied him. Geoengineeringwatch.org supplied to Ray. So Ray has done extraordinary work. He's the only one that we know of that has so diligently tried to address this issue and dedicated so much time to metering. Ray, we're extremely grateful to you for the work you've done, which has helped us to try to get this issue to light. First of all, hello, Ray, and can you hear me okay?
I hear you fine, Dane, and thanks for the accolades there. I'm pretty much in the same boat that you are. My dedication is to this planet, to my kids, my family, and this is the work that I do is well beyond passion. It's a necessity, and this is what I have to do. It just is what I have to do. On days when I don't want to get out of bed, I get out of bed and I take data. It's just that kind of a thing. It's extremely critical, and it's been whitewashed over the years to the point to where it's so complicated of a science issue that no one wants to be involved with it. Like you were saying, Geoengineering Watch supplied a piece of equipment. It's a lab instrument. It's a spectral radiometer, and it has incredible features with it. It scans between 200 and 450 nanometers, and it has sub-nanometer resolution. I can basically take data from 1/6 of a nanometer, from 200 nanometers to 450 nanometers. And the idea first came into my my head back in 2016 about doing such a thing because I had been working with NASA satellite data for about 2 years. And the last data I worked with was from the Ceres satellite. And the problem I encountered was that all of the data stops at 300 nanometers. They'll scan from 300 on up, but the scanning microbolometer that they use with the Ceres satellite system stops at 300 nanometers.
On that point, Ray, for the listeners, let's take a moment to educate them on how the UV radiation spectrum breaks down. We have, it's from 400 to 320 is UVA, Ray, is that correct?
Yeah, I usually start at the high end of the spectrum and work up towards the visible light.
Which would be above 400 nanometers, would that be correct?
400 nanometers and above is visible to infrared.
And UVB starting from 320 to 280 nanometers, I believe UVC from 280 to 100. Is that correct, I think, Ray?
Yes.
We're told officially that all incoming UV radiation, or the percentage of incoming UV radiation is 95% UVA, 5% UVB, and no UVC. That's what we're officially told. And that is patently false, is it not, Ray?
I have yet to find the person who's doing those measurements.
But that's what's officially stated.
Officially stated, several organizations state that no UVC radiation reaches the Earth's surface. It's wrong. I have data to prove that.
And we metered even before your work, which is the most advanced work on the subject at all. But even with more basic readings that we took with less sophisticated metering equipment before you took over with, again, more expertise. But we were showing levels of UVC in the surface as well. And this is easily detectable with the right metering equipment, but yet it's being systematically hidden. Is that not true?
It is being hidden. For what reasons, I'm unsure of at this point.
Wouldn't you think it'd be, I mean, the ramifications are beyond grave. I mean, this is something if the public was aware of, I would say that's a very evident reason that to avoid panic, because the loss of the ozone layer is an existential threat. And if you compress the ozone layer to a single molecular layer at sea surface, it's the thickness of 2.5 dimes, 6 millimeters, that allows life to exist on this Earth. Would that be a correct assessment?
Yeah, under the standard column of air at sea level, we're looking at maximum of about 1/4 inch. And right now, because of the depletion that's been taking place over the last 40, 50 years, I would be surprised if it is 2 dimes worth right now. I think it's far less than 6 millimeters.
Given the readings we are getting, yes. I mean, I certainly agree. That's an assessment of what it would be if it was intact, which it certainly is not intact. The increase in UVC radiation that from readings you took from 2019 to 2020, there was a profound increase. Is that correct?
Yeah. Now, I started back in 2016. My first radiation measurements were at Mount Hamilton, and that was at an altitude of about 4,300 feet. So there was an air column. I knew the astronomer at the observatory, and he gave me access to electricity, and I sat up there and I did a 6-hour session, took the data home, and I couldn't believe the data, Dane. It actually, it scared the bejeebers out of me, because UVC was extremely high. I mean, I was seeing 1.5 to 1.6 microwatts per square centimeter in the UVC region.
To put that into context on UVC again, we are told 0 UVC should reach the planet.
No, that's incorrect.
Correct.
In 1994-95, when I worked at NASA, Our goal was to establish a platform for sensors to monitor the ozone layer at 80,000 feet. Okay, that's my first exposure to the conundrum with the ozone destruction. NASA has changed the verbiage on their website. They now state most UVC is absorbed by our upper atmosphere. And there is some truth in that.
To elaborate on what most means, when NASA says now, instead of all UVC being stopped at altitude 100,000 feet up, now most of it is stopped. I equate that to stating the ship we're floating on is mostly watertight. And that's not good enough. That's not good enough. You're not going to get far on a ship that's mostly watertight. And that hole in the bottom of the boat is getting bigger by the day. Is that a correct assessment, Ray? The hole, i.e., the ozone depletion scenario is getting worse by the day. Would you consider that a correct statement?
Absolutely. I've seen anywhere from a 7 to 10% reduction in our ozone layer because of the increased intensity of the UVC region since 2016, Dane.
And that's a very short increment of time for that type of increase. Now, in regard to UVC, you saw a much larger percentage increase still from 2019 to 2020 in 1 year. Is that correct?
Yes. I have seen, in some areas of the spectrum, I have seen as much as 150 to 200% increase over the last year.
To put it in the simplest terms possible, if that type of increase continues for any length of time, it will soon be game over for terrestrial life on planet Earth. Is that a correct statement?
That's exactly right. 2016, when I took the data home from Mount Hamilton, I did a trend analysis that all things remaining the same, by 2025, we would not be able to grow crops outdoors in direct sunlight.
And indeed, this is where clarification is needed, because many people tend to think then that everything's fine till that date and then everything's different. And that's not the case. It's a progression.
Exactly.
And that's important for people to understand. And we're seeing right now the UV levels are so intense. It's burning foliage. Again, it's burning the Cambrian layers, which is the bark that's the living part of the tree, burning it right down to the core wood. We're seeing the attempt to shade crops in California, even along I-5. I've seen citrus now shaded, and that's certainly unprecedented, shaded as far as the eye can see across the valley. How can that type of effort possibly continue if we have to shade plants from the sun, which they need to photosynthesize? And further, in regard to photosynthesis, with this changed light spectrum, there are grave ramifications for that, even in regard to plants being able to photosynthesize while being exposed to this level of radiation. And that is stunting plant growth. We already see that. It's mutating, in some cases, the foliage. And what we see in the forest is what we experience there now. There's no forest smell in the forest any longer. The trees, because of the intense UV radiation and another factor called vapor pressure deficit, which is a lack of humidity in the air. But the trees are not respirating. They're not breathing. They're not feeding. They're unable to grow this way. And Ray, have you been able to spend any time in a forested area? Have you seen or experienced that scenario? Just the lack of forest smell.
In 2017, I flew over the Rockies to California, to the Sierras. And the south side of the mountains, all the trees were gray. They were dead. The trees on the north side, the sun-shaded side of the mountains, were better. But the trees on the south side towards the sun suffered severe radiation damage. And I mean, I saw millions of acres from the air from 40,000 feet. Millions of acres of dead trees. And I called the forestry department inquiring about it. I spent a couple of weeks investigating this, and I found one person at the research center in Colorado who knew something about UV radiation and the trees, but they declined to admit anything over the telephone. Even when I told them I would not repeat their name or their information to anyone that I wanted it just for my own private information. They know what's going on.
In regard to the damage on foliage and tree trunks, it's important to specify that regions, for example, in the western U.S. are much more susceptible to this because we've been kept under an ionosphere-created high-pressure dome, which spins the upper-level wind currents clockwise, which appears to be being utilized by the climate engineers to spin the moisture around the western U.S. while it's being chemically nucleated. This is a form of cloud seeding, patented processes of chemical ice nucleation for weather modification, which cools down the cloud moisture, creates a colder, denser layer of air in the ground. And as they continue to cool this air mass, as it rotates around the western U.S. high-pressure dome and into the eastern U.S., they're able to keep the eastern half of the continental 48 states cooler. And in fact, over the last now 9 years, the most anomalously less warm region on the entire planet is the eastern half of the U.S. lower 48. That doesn't mean there hasn't been record warm temperatures there in between these cool downs, but statistically speaking, which is one of the objectives of the climate engineers, to create surface cool downs under which they take a tremendous amount of readings, temperature readings, when it's cooler, and they use that to skew the overall statistics to create the appearance that regions are not as warm as they actually are. When there's record heat in a region, they'll take far fewer temperature readings. In fact, perhaps 10 times less temperature readings, so as not to reveal the true degree of warming. So in regard to the damage to foliage and tree trunks, the scorching from the UV, it's less visible, far less visible in regions that have been kept under more consistent cloud cover with more consistent precipitation. There is less of this UV damage, but in the regions that have been exposed to the constant high pressure domes and the radically high UV radiation levels, more in the western US, the UV damage is absolutely profound. Ray, based on the current rate of ozone destruction, where do your calculations lead us? How much time do we have until we completely lose the ozone layer and it's game over on planet Earth?
That's exactly what I've been trying to figure out, Dane. I can't honestly answer that question yet. Some days here I take data and it looks like that 2025 figure was too good to be true because it looks like it may be shorter than that. There are some days that I go outside and it's like, this isn't going to last 2 years. With them playing with the atmosphere the way they are with electromagnetics and all the radiation techniques that they're using right now with the different radar systems, microwave manipulation. The technology is phenomenal, what they're being able to do, but they don't realize the adverse effects of every action that they do causes a problem. And they're not willing to look beyond what they want to do versus what's going to happen after they do it. Okay? The weather modification programs that you mentioned have been going on for a long, long time. Rain isn't going to fix this one. The particulates in the air, what they're putting in their aerosol injection, in order to have clean water, you have to have clean air. The adverse effects from the plant photosynthesis process is unknown. We don't have biochemical engineers that are capable of saying this particular wavelength of energy is needed for photosynthesis, and this one, if it's too much, will cause the plant to stop living and intake foods. They don't know enough about it. What I do know is that there is a section of radiation that is extremely dangerous, and that is in the 270 nanometer region, which is the focus of my research. That region is called actinic because the net result of it on all DNA is that the DNA, RNA becomes 9,000 times more sensitive to this particular wavelength than all the other wavelengths of radiation from the sun. 9,000 times. So when I see an increase of 1.1 to 1.7 microwatts per square centimeter. That's horrific.
Let's look at past science acknowledgement of what geoengineering would do if they were to deploy it. And this is, again, under the masquerade that it hasn't been going on for 75 years already, which it clearly has been. Data is irrefutable in that regard. Up-close film footage of aircraft, military tankers, KC-10s, KC-35s, C-17s, at altitude, nozzles visible, turning aerosol dispersions on and off. We have articles like this from Think Progress. This is from 2008. Here's the title of this report. Science, geoengineering scheme damages the ozone layer. From this report, subheadline, Science has published a major new study, the sensitivity of polar ozone depletion to proposed geoengineering schemes.
So there are all sorts of side effects. I'll get to them in a second, but if you put sulfuric acid in the stratosphere, for example, you could deplete stratospheric ozone. Smaller size means more surface area, but more surface area means less ozone.
As if it would only deplete the ozone layer over the polar regions. And this is, again, where we see with other, quote, science geoengineering studies stating that it would disrupt precipitation patterns over other countries. They never mention the U.S. They say it will disrupt the precipitation pattern over Asia and parts of Europe, but they don't mention the U.S. because they feel, and it seems correctly so, that the U.S. population won't care as long as it doesn't disrupt their rain. But in fact, of course it's disrupting their rain. You can't engineer any part of the planet in regard to the climate and not affect the entire planet. Here's another excerpt from this 2008 Think Progress science report. They state this: pumping particles into the atmosphere to mimic the cooling effect of large volcanic eruptions has been proposed as a last-ditch solution to combating climate change, but doing so would cause problems of its own, including potentially catastrophic drought, say researchers. What do we see over the western U.S., what we've just seen over Australia, other parts of Europe, many regions around the world? We see unprecedented drought. That factor in overall reduction of global precipitation is impossible based on the laws of physics on a warming planet unless there's a factor we're not being told about. And that factor is climate engineering, the desiccant particulates that are not only destroying the ozone layer, but that are completely derailing the Earth's hydrological cycle. And all of this, Ray, even that alteration of atmospheric relative humidity, along with the particles and the oxidative effect they have on elements in the atmosphere, all of that has grave ramifications for the ozone layer itself, does it not?
Absolutely, Dean. About 3 weeks ago, I wanted to find out how it was that I came to work at NASA to begin with. And back in 1988, there is a C-SPAN video on ozone depletion. And I invite everybody to go see it, because that is the last time that the ozone depletion was actually in the public consciousness.
That ozone depletion in the upper atmosphere is a serious threat to humanity, and one which the United States intends to deal with quickly and in good faith. Humanity is now in a race against the time to prevent the hole from lasting 12 months a year and quite likely disrupting the global patterns of atmospheric circulation.
And ever since then, it's been nothing but a political football. And who is getting the most research funding to do what function? And it's just turned out totally upside down. See, ozone's created from oxygen at the top of atmosphere. When oxygen is at the top of atmosphere and is bombarded by the UVC radiation, it actually splits the oxygen O2 into O1s, and they meet up with other O2s and combine to form an O3, which is ozone. And then it becomes a shield against the very same harmful radiation that caused the ozone to exist in the first place. With the geoengineering that's going on right now with the particulates up there, yeah, they're radiating some of this, reflecting some of this radiation back into space. But what they're doing is they're destroying more ozone in the process. The particulate aerosols being injected into our atmosphere by the current geoengineering programs inhibit the ability of oxygen to reach the top of atmosphere by stripping the free-form oxygen molecule from the atmosphere before it even reaches 60,000 feet. The upper ozone layer is created at the top of atmosphere, which can be anywhere from 80,000 feet on up, depending on atmospheric currents. The oxygen being stripped from the atmosphere was expounded on in the ozone depletion C-SPAN video from 1988. Somewhat, but at that time they were more focused on the chlorofluorocarbons being the major cause. Yet all pollution in our atmosphere will strip oxygen from the atmosphere. Free-form oxygen, as O2, is a very small light molecule and is easily attracted to larger, heavier molecules. By molecular attraction of those heavier molecules and atmospheric electrostatic attraction, it is being stripped from the atmosphere by those larger molecules, and when it combines with another molecule, the oxygen molecule can no longer reach the upper atmosphere to form ozone. Remember that ozone is created by solar UVC radiation, so no ozone is created at nighttime. Whatever holes in the ozone layer that exist during the daylight hours will exist at night also, and with atmospheric currents will eventually affect a thinning of the entire upper ozone layer over a period of time. There is only one solution. Stop geoengineering.
I would completely agree. And we have what's called scientifically termed double catastrophe scenario, trying to make the case, they are trying to make the case that once you start climate engineering, you can never, ever stop, as if that's a reality, as if you could possibly continue spraying the skies with highly toxic heavy metal and polymer nanoparticulates indefinitely, forever. So the bottom line is, although there is tremendous energy built up in the climate system, and that energy will release so long as the planet's climate functions like its cloud-making ability, which at this point is being radically damaged. If those functions are still intact and climate engineering is brought to a halt, and it will stop at some point, one way or another, the blowback will indeed be immense, but the planet must be allowed to find a new equilibrium based on the damage already done. If the ongoing damage advances to the point where the planet loses its ability to make clouds, and this is something people take for granted, then we end up with Venus syndrome, where the oceans boil off into the atmosphere. The atmosphere is 100 times more dense. I'm describing exactly what Venus is. It's 100 times more dense than Earth. The solar thermal energy gets in, but it doesn't get out, and now we have temperatures on the ground of 900 degrees. We have a sister planet to Venus. Plankton are a primary cloud-making mechanism for the planet, and elements they emit into the atmosphere. Trees as well. We are losing those cloud-making mechanisms by the day. And if that happens, again, there is no going back.